What's up? It's Rowan here from Artist Mind Education with the weekly HSC Eco stats update. In this episode, we're unpacking all things Trump tariffs. What are they? Why is he doing it? What will the impact be on Australia? If it's your first time dialing in these episodes, I share with you the key stats and headlines from around the domestic and global economy, giving you the key analysis you need to unlock a Band 6 in the HSC Economics course. So let's dive right in. So firstly, why is Trump implementing tariffs? Well, at the end of the day, there's a couple of really simple reasons. Firstly, it's designed to boost US federal revenues. Nice, the US has a huge debt, and one of the big things that the US government and Trump is trying to do is try to get that under control. Secondly, they have big trade deficits with a number of countries, one of those particularly being China. What that means is that they import more than they export. The result of that over many years has been offshoring, where American industries have left America due to the cost of manufacture, and they've moved to China, Southeast Asia, Mexico. And so the reality then that has for the US economy is it impacts unemployment, it impacts GDP growth. And so one of the big things that it's trying to do is, yes, in reducing the trade deficit, give an artificial advantage to domestic industries and encourage reshoring, the process whereby TNCs, American companies, bring manufacturing back into the US economy and actually manufacture goods on America's soil. Now, ultimately, that's the goals, Now, there's a couple of other things in here as well, which is also to seek to prevent fentanyl from illegally entering the US, and finally, reduce the US's dependence on global supply chains and counter the illicit transfer of technologies and intellectual property. That's particularly dealing with China. One of the big things that America has struggled with many years is that to work and to set up, industry and manufacturing plants in China, you need to have a local partner. Typically, what that has often resulted in, therefore, then is copying of intellectual property, theft of intellectual property that the US has developed, and then Chinese manufacturers making these for very, very cheap prices without needing to sort of bear the costs of the R&D that's been required. So there's a broad number of reasons we can see why the Trump administration is implementing these tariffs. Now, will these tariffs achieve all of these outcomes? That's a very different story. Now, what are these tariffs, and then what will the likely impact be, short of clearly impacting global supply chains? So what do we know so far? Well, the first thing is tariffs on China. Now, note, this is an additional tariffs to what Trump originally implemented in his first administration, because note, the one thing that the Trump and Biden administrations agreed upon was the position to China in relation to trade. And so Trump's original tariffs and protection that was put in place was continued under the Biden administration, Now, ultimately, therefore, what we can see is this is an additional 10% imposed on all Chinese goods entering the US, with no exceptions. So it's a very significant broad brush tariff. Now, at the end of the day, what we can already see is that this has created a retaliatory effect. So China has responded, they've introduced a number of tariffs, but they've been targeted. It's not across everything, So it's on commodities, it's a 15% tariff on US coal, liquefied gas, 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery. And they've also, on top of that, filed a case in the World Trade Organization's dispute mechanism. Now, of course, there's a little bit of an irony there because, Australia has been on the receiving end of some protective behaviours by China in relation to, lobsters and wine, amongst other things, and we've certainly filed, our own disputes. Now, the reality is we know the WTO is a toothless tiger. It's really got an inability, particularly for large economies, to have any impact. And so really we can see what China's trying to do here is sort of claim some moral ground and some sort of high ground here, but the reality is it'll have, almost zero, if not negative impact here, really, on how the US responds. Now, there's been additional tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Note, some of these are not just purely for economic reasons. I think it could be argued that they've also been implemented because trade, from Trump's perspective, is really a leverage point and a bargaining chip that can be used to extract other concessions on non-trade items from other countries. Note, the thing that's relevant for Australia, though, particularly, is a tariff on steel and aluminium, 25% to be imposed across all steel and aluminium imports with no exceptions. Now, the with no exceptions thing is important because at the end of the day, Australia here actually has a 2-decade-old free trade agreement with the United States, Our Australia-United States free trade agreement. And so, on the one hand, we could hope to, great, our trade is actually defined by that agreement. But the truth is that Canada and Mexico had equally long-standing free trade agreements with the US, and those were ignored very, very easily. And so I think for Australia, we're not going to be really able to rely as much necessarily on that free trade agreement. And really, again, this is probably an example of Trump using trade to really, redefine some of these long-standing agreements that, from his perspective, no longer necessarily work for the US economy. Now, note, let's assume for a moment, okay, that these tariffs are going to apply. Now, note, right, the Australian government is attempting to negotiate a exception, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, okay, what will these global measures mean? Now, first of all, they're designed to come through on March the 12th. That's why we're covering it now. They're going to be coming through soon, okay? But there are going to be some impacts, right? And I think the first is, the cost of operations in the US will potentially increase, okay? So supply chain costs for Australian businesses with operations in the US may rise, okay? Because many of these businesses may depend on supply chains linked to Canada and Mexico and Chinese markets, right? And so if you're having to import intermediate or unfinished goods, right, you're going to have tariffs that are going to just create a bit of an inflationary impact, right? Now, of course, there's going to be an indirect impact on Australia through global supply chains, right? So just the reality is that, if we're needing to bring things in from China and the US, okay, it may cause delays and increase costs, okay? And so it could, unfortunately, stoke further inflationary pressure in the Australian economy, which obviously, not great given how hot inflation has been running, okay? Now, generally, again, we're seeing just broadly, this inflationary impact, right? E-commerce shipments may slow and costs increase, compliance burden and costs increase, okay? Freight in a potential state of flux, so we may see this impact, just global shipping. And so far, if we sort of categorize all of those, the general sense is it's going to lead to increased costs, right? And delays in supply chain. I think we can summarize it like that, which will have an impact for Australian businesses that rely, right, on intermediate goods as part of, their process. So they're importing intermediate goods, domestic businesses that are relying on that will see imported inflation there. But also we may see just simply increased costs in imports, which may also then alter our terms of trade, okay? Because we'll see the cost of imports rise quicker than the price that we're receiving for our exports. So there's a couple of factors there. Now, of course, we may also see currency fluctuations occur as a result of this, okay? And, we could see the result that, we get dumping, right? Australia becomes a dumping ground because all of a sudden, US markets, no, it's too expensive. Where can we sell this? Well, we'll dump this in other markets. Oh, we'll dump excess stock in Australia. Now, of course, it doesn't just have to be Australia. This could be potentially in any number of other countries as well. But we could see that occur. So that's really, I think, a little bit of like the big picture, right? What are some other things that, we should be considering here? Well, first of all, right, what is Australia trying to do about it, okay? And, will these tariffs come into play or not for Australia? And so if we go and take a little bit of a look, right, ultimately what the US is trying to do is, as we talked about, change their trade relationship with the world, and certainly particular countries because they're in a trade deficit. Now, our hope for Australia is that we actually are one of the rare countries that have a trade surplus. Well, the US has a trade surplus with us. What that means, essentially, right, is that they export way more to Australia than they import from us. In other words, if we flip it the other way, okay, what that means is that, in Australia's case, we import from the US way more than we export to the US, okay? And that's what we can see here. Now, ultimately, this is a bilateral, right, rather than the overall balance. So the overall balance that you see on the box, on the current account, represents exports minus imports for Australia with every other country in the world, rather than, so you could sort of argue that's more multilateral, right? Where what Trump is particularly focused on is bilateral with specific countries. Now, a lot of this, I think, plays into this idea that the way that Trump views the world is as a zero-sum game. You either win or you lose, right? There's not a win-win. And so Trump, as a result, is very much looking at individually, okay, are we winning with China? Are we winning with Canada? Are we winning with Mexico? Are we winning with Australia? So because we have a trade surplus, okay, with the US, okay, the hope here, okay, is that maybe this may cause a stay in the tariffs. Now, to give you a bit of context, okay, the goods and services trade surplus is about 14 billion, okay? Now, that's in the US, Australian dollars 22 billion, okay, and that was in 2023, okay? So you can compare that, though, to the trade deficit the US has with China, okay, which is significant. That's a $582 billion Australian, US, $925 billion Australian, right? Trade deficit with China. So you can sort of see that, okay, there's a couple of countries where this is going to make a much bigger difference. Will it really make an impact, if the tariffs come on for Australia? Well, no, we're already in a trade surplus. And so that really is the argument, okay, that we're going to be hoping. So at the moment, the exemption has not been secured. The government's still working at it, okay? We'll have to see whether or not that plays out here, okay? But at the end of the day, I think, what we can sort of understand is that, look, if the tariffs come in, the good news here is, because of that trade surplus, we don't export a lot of, steel. We don't export a lot of the things, right? If we go back and take a look, right, in terms of, it's going to be steel and aluminium, okay? We don't export a lot of those to the US. We export some for sure. So the reality is the impact for Australia directly, will be small. It'll have some impact for sure. But I think what we should be really, regardless of whether or not the tariffs come in for Australia or not, be paying attention to, certainly for topic 1, Australia's place in the global economy, and the impact that it might have on our balance of payments. Topic 2 is looking at how these tariffs and a renewed trade war, particularly between the US and China, will play out and impact Australia more through indirect impacts rather than direct. So there we have it, a quick update on all things tariffs, Trump, and the impact on Australia. As we get further updates, particularly if Australia can get exemption, I'll share those in future episodes. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I will see you next week.